Hello and welcome to the 2022 Ohioana Book Festival. This is Mark Dawidziak, and I'm pleased to bid you welcome to Don't Turn Out the Lights, our panel featuring three of Ohio's most creative and dynamic writers of horror fiction and poetry. Now, before we venture too deeply into that dark realm Ray Bradbury once described as the October country, we'd like to thank our festival sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find listed on the Ohioana website. And thanks to our official bookseller, the Book Loft of German Village. You can get copies of all the books featured at the festival by going online to bookloft.com. I'd also like to add just a quick note. It's an honor to be moderating this panel, not just because of my admiration for the three wonderful writers you're about to meet, but because of my great admiration for horror as a genre. It's not a genre that always gets its proper due, appreciation, or respect. But I can't emphasize enough something that the mystery writer John D. MacDonald once wrote. And he wrote it in an introduction to the first collection of short stories by a young writer named Stephen King. MacDonald, who is known as a writer's writer, said that humor and horror were the two forms that tended to get relegated to the children's table of literature. But among writers themselves, it was accepted that these were by far the two most difficult forms to master. And in MacDonald's words, I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but essentially what he said, they were the two most difficult forms because in the wrong hands, the horror becomes humorous and the humor becomes horrible. So today we are talking to three writers who have accepted the challenge of walking the nightmare side of the street. And they are Leanna Renee Hieber, E.F. Schraeder, and Lucy A. Snyder. Welcome to you all. I'm going to start by asking each of them to tell you a little bit about their most recent book or books and how those books fit into their ongoing individual journeys as horror writers. First up is Leanna Renee Hieber. And hello, Leanna, with fond memories of being on a Ohioana panel devoted to horror in 2017.
Absolutely.
Leanna is an actress, playwright, ghost tour guide, and the award-winning best-selling author of Gothic gaslamp fantasy novels such as The Strangely Beautiful, Magic Most Foul, Eternophiles, and the Spectral City series. Leanna can tell you a little bit more about herself. And let me start with that first question of tell us a little bit about your most recent book, a little bit more about yourself, and a little bit about how that book fits into your ongoing journey.
Thank you. Well, I'm always glad to be here with my fellow cohorts. I love Ohioana's mission, and I will always be an Ohioan, even if I am in New York. And my journey started in theater, and I was always writing in the background, and all of the things that I ever wrote always had ghosts in them and always had some element of magic and mystery and fantastical things. I'm a very cross-genre writer, so while I have horror elements in my work, I'm not exclusively a horror author, and I know I share that with a lot of my fellow panelists in being cross-genre and bringing in different elements into our work. I have horrific themes, but I don't necessarily stay in that horrific place. So my stories tend to work their way through the nightmares out towards a happy ending. That's just because I like to live in that place where we've come out from the other side of the nightmare. But in the capacity of the Ohioana Book Festival, I'm really happy to be sharing an anthology that I'm very honored to be a part of. It's a charity anthology. So it's called Giving the Devil His Due. And it is an anthology benefiting the Pixel Project, which helps to end violence against women and gender-based violence. And it is seeking to raise awareness about domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And the Pixel Project tries to utilize this. Their aim is through education and dialogue and using writers to talk about the themes of abuse and how can we as a society get on the other side of that nightmare ourselves. So in this anthology, I have a story called Escape from Pleasant Point, which is a part of my overarching Hieberverse of connected characters that are all set in the late Victorian era, so late 19th century. And I have very strong women who are facing lots of adversities. And so it's not just about a time when these women are struggling for their rights, but they're also trying to work towards their own identities and self-determination and agency. So in Escape from Pleasant Point, it's very much a traditional Gothic setting, as all of my work is, in that there's a woman who is in a place that she cannot control, and she has been unfairly institutionalized in a mental hospital. This was something that was very common in the 19th century. And so I addressed this particular horror in that story. And it's my matriarch character, Evelyn North. Evelyn North Stewart has been with me through 9 books. And she's most recently featured as a co-star in my Spectral City series. So this is her most recent incarnation as this grandmother matriarch. And Evelyn told me a bit about her early life, and her early life was very hard during this institutionalized process. So this really goes back to the formative days of Evelyn's teenage years when she's been imprisoned. And I deal with the abuses therein. It's both historical in the fact that these abuses happened to women indiscriminately very often. Anyone who was sort of different or outside the norm could be that would be a mark to possibly institutionalize them. It's very scary to me. So that's my horror, the idea of the lack of agency, the lack of freedom that implies. So in that way, I could bring an element that was already present in my work into this charity angle as a discussion point of coming out on the other side of a traumatic past, and how could there be a story of redemptive there's a bit of redemptive violence sort of in this, in a sort of getting back at the abusers sort of way, but done in a very paranormal manner. I don't want to spoil the story, but all of these stories deal with fantastical and paranormal and horror solutions to the idea of abuse. So that's both a horrific topic, but talking about it in a constructive way. Thank you.
Thank you. E.F. Schraeder is an admirer of strange wonders and sleights of hand. Schraeder writes poetry and fiction, often inspired by not quite real worlds. The author of Liar, Memoirs of a Haunting, and Ghostly Tales of Gaiety and Greed, Schraeder also authored 2 poetry chapbooks. Awarded first place in Crystal Lake Publishing's 2021 Poetry Contest, Schraeder's work has appeared in Strange Horizons, Mystery Weekly Magazine, The Feminist Wire, and other journals and anthologies. E, welcome, and the same question to you. Tell us a little bit about your most recent work and how that fits into your ongoing journey.
Sure, thank you. And thanks again for the great intro. I'm going to tap into some of those comments you made about horror and humor, which is a really interesting
well, they're twins, aren't they?
Point. Yes, they are. Evil twins, perhaps. So, yeah, some of my recent work is a little bit of a departure from things that I've done in the past, but my journey is certainly influenced primarily by my fondness for poetry and academic background. That's probably the genre that I've spent the most time studying in depth, although I have done intensive fiction workshops and that sort of thing, and have beta reading groups and all that good stuff. But I love poetry, and I say that with a little trepidation. Not everybody does, but it's April and it's National Poetry Month, so I'll come out of that particular closet. And I say that it influences me in part because I tend towards short work, if that makes sense. I like novellas, I like short stories, I like work that can be wrapped up. I have yet to embark on a series, although I do have a character that I think wants me to consider writing a series that won't get out of my head. So I'd say when it comes to horror, most of my work depends on 2 things. There is often an element of the paranormal or sometimes the occult, and there's often a psychological angle. Based on Liar, for a minute it felt like isolation was my brand, but I don't think that's quite true. The work that I'm centering attention to for this visit to Ohioana is quite a departure from that. It's a little bit less psychological and a lot more I guess I'd say a lot more overtly violent. And it has quite a bit more humor in it, which is a weird combo, but somehow this is one of those instances where the character sort of dictated a bit of the way she handles turning into something she doesn't understand. So the work is called As Fast as She Can, and it sort of traces this girl's journey from thinking she's a normal kid, a normal adopted kid, going about her business and realizing something is very, very wrong with her parents and something is very, very wrong with some of her impulses. And so how she handles that becomes sort of an internal humorous monologue, as well as her misadventures, I guess we can call them. And I guess in terms of my own approach to horror, my own interest, longtime fan of the genre, longtime reader of the genre, it's always sort of where I hung my happy hat. Growing up, it was always the cheesiest, weirdest, most obscure, awful movies that I could dig my teeth into, or weird stories. I'd like to think I was sort of raised by rabid librarians in a way that pointed me in this direction, and it just kept growing. So maybe that's my own strange horror hunger that I've developed over the years. But yeah, so that's a little bit about me. I also, in a nutshell, I like to say about the work, especially since I've sort of framed this as a bit more violent than I usually write. I write horror where the dog always lives. I think that's something people can count on with me. There may be some violence, but it's of a certain ilk. So there we are.
Thank you.
Sure.
I want to revisit something that both of you have already said. So this is a panel which could easily go 3 hours if I had my druthers on this. So we got an hour, so I'll try to keep things moving. Lucy A. Snyder. Lucy is the Shirley Jackson Award nominated and 5-time Bram Stoker award-winning author of 15 books and over 100 published short stories. Her most recent books are The Collection, Halloween Season, and the poetry collection Exposed Nerves. Lucy, welcome to the Ohioana panel, and same question to you.
All right, my most recent book is Exposed Nerves, which you mentioned. It's up for a Bram Stoker Award, but we won't know how it does until next month. The poems in the book are a mix. The first section is pretty much straightforward horror. And then the book segues into more mainstream poetry, more stuff about the experience of being a woman, which is sometimes pretty horrific, frankly. But I touch on themes such as, chronic illness, death, of course, the frustrations of daily life, racism, things like that. And then the final section of poems in the book is science fiction. So I think the book reflects my own interests as a writer. I've written horror since I started writing, but I've also written science fiction, I've written fantasy, I've written mainstream work. People ask me, well, why did you write a poetry collection? This is actually my second collection. My first one was a book called Chimeric Machines about 10 years ago. That seems to be what I'm doing. About every 10 years, I come out with a poetry collection. I really enjoy writing poetry. I really enjoy reading poetry. The challenges with it are that it's less popular than the other forms. Of course, novels are the most popular form in terms of, fiction, and then fewer people read short stories, and fewer people still read poetry, which I think is a real shame. I mean, there's a lot that fiction writers can learn from both reading and writing poetry. So, it's a really great thing to work on, just to kind of work on your descriptive chops, for instance. And there's a lot of crossover between writing and microfiction styles, drabble, splash fiction, that sort of thing, and writing poems. There have been a couple of times where I've written a narrative poem that I just couldn't make go in terms of, the scansion, or in terms of, kind of how it was landing. And I'd take it out of stanzas and I'd have a perfectly workable flash fiction piece. So, that tends to work. And then a couple of times I've taken flash fiction and reworked it into poetry and things like that. So it's kind of fun to go back and forth. Um, the most recent collection came about as a result of me saying, okay, look, I've been kind of writing to assignment for a really long time. Like for the previous 10 years, I'd pretty much been getting short story assignments or invitations to write for particular things, invitations to write articles. And that was keeping me really busy. And I'd realized that poetry had kind of fallen by the wayside. And I thought, okay, we got to stop this. So I started a Patreon a few years back. And one of the features that I offer are new poems. And so I used the Patreon as a way to get myself to write more poetry. And at the end of like the first year and a half, I thought, well, I've got a really nice stack of poems. Let me go through them and see if they make sense as a whole. And they did. And so the book has been doing pretty well. And that's about what I have right now.
Well, sadly, of course, poetry pays the least too.
True.
It's always been a problem. But you know, if in the horror realm, of course, if everybody is still reading The Raven and Annabelle Lee, it speaks to the incredible, you know, resonance of poetry in this realm as well. So I've always been kind of surprised that there isn't more of it. And there's a, you know, and I really want, you know, there are a lot of questions which come to mind from what everybody just said. And I'm just going to pick one because just something strikes me just sort of looking at the panel right now, which is, you know, when I first started to become what we now call a monster kid. We didn't have that term back in the 60s, but you know, now we call somebody who grew up and enamored of all things in the spooky realm a monster kid. When I was growing up in the 60s, if there had been a panel like this, everybody on the panel would have looked like me.
Yeah.
You know, the finger on the hand, the trigger of horror in the 1960s was almost exclusively male and exclusively white. And there was very occasionally, the exceptions were so big. We always talked about, oh, Mary Shelley and Shirley Jackson, you know, and that was like, you know, they were the exceptions and they were like the grand exceptions. But the fact that over the last 30 years, diversity has crept into this wonderful form where you can metaphorically deal with so many different things. And you've all sort of touched about it in your thing. So I kind of want you guys you to talk about this a little bit, and maybe we'll do this in reverse. Lucy, why don't you take this first?
Okay.
I think this is a wonderful thing about the form, and something you don't see in some other forms of literature is that you have more voices coming in all the time, it seems. And that's true in film and television and literature. You see a lot more diversity in this genre.
Poetry is incredibly diverse, and it's really odd. There are more like little groups of poets out there, and you have to really kind of go looking for each other. It's like there's a bunch of us who work in horror poetry that, like, for instance, Stoker voters are aware of, and people who tend to show up on the ballots there. But then there are people who are writing literary poetry that's just as dark and should really be showing up on the Stoker ballot, but because people are reading in these sort of like smaller pools, it's kind of harder to become aware of those other voices, but they're certainly out there and they have their own audiences. But I was just thinking the other day about like the difference between written poets and slam poets. I mean, that's a huge world right there. You know, if regular writers haven't been to any slam poetry events, I mean, A, they're missing out, but B, it's really incredible. You'll sometimes see a piece on the page that you'll think, well, this is nice, but it's nothing special. But then you'll hear the poet perform it and you'll just be blown away. I mean, the performance adds such a dimension to it that is just not apparent from straight up reading it. But yeah, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but yeah, there are a lot of different poetry communities out there and poetry groups, and they're all over the place. And you won't necessarily be aware of what's happening in Yarn City unless you go out there and go looking for it. But it's a really rich world out there.
Yeah, Lucy, I may have asked that badly, which was entirely possible. But I was also speaking of the entire horror genre.
Oh yeah, there's a lot happening.
And I'll ask you why, you know, the origins of this. Why do you think this has occurred? That, you know, there's quite a turnaround. I would say that a lot more horror is coming from, you know, non-traditional places than the traditional places now.
I think a lot of it has to do with there was always the interest out there, but back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was pretty difficult to get published. I mean, there was kind of the difference between either you were kind of a wannabe, but then you broke through and then you became a pro. There were some people working in the small press, but there were much clearer delineations. But now there are a lot more opportunities to get published. There are a lot more opportunities to learn how to write. You know, it's no longer a situation of, well, if you want to be a pro, you have to go, you get an MFA, or you have to get a college degree, you have to be in the right place at the right time. We have the internet now. So people can connect who couldn't connect before. And there are a lot of opportunities for people to publish their own zines and magazines and anthologies, and people are doing that. I think the challenge anymore is that it's a lot more difficult because of wage stagnation for somebody to really make a living as a professional writer versus back in the olden days. Like, you know, decades ago, like if you had a book out a year, you'd be doing fine. And now that's a start, which is unfortunate because, if you're taking your time with your work, you might not be able to do a book a year even, you might be looking at a book every 2 years. It just, kind of depends on, where you're at and what you're doing. But yeah, there are definitely a lot more opportunities for diverse voices to be heard, to find publication. And, that's a really great thing. And of course, it's not just the straight up indie presses. People are self-publishing. A lot of people have said, you know what, my work can't find a home, so I'm going to just go straight to readers and, see how it does. And some people have had great, great, great success with that.
It's also historic. I just wanted to pop in on a historical perspective about this, because if you look at Gothic fiction, all of this is cyclical, because if you look back at the 19th century, there was a press called Minerva Press in the 19th century that was doing exclusively Gothic fiction, and almost all of it was being written by women in the Victorian era. And so when you look at like the ghost story, there are various presses, from Charles Dickens' Household Words to any number of journals around the world, ghost stories were being written by women. And so there is historic precedent for this. I think we are in a new renaissance of the Gothic right now, in my lifetime, which then again allows for a greater diversity of voices, because the Gothic is really dealing with the psychological, and it really is dealing with a very personal focus. And so with that, you really do have a certain finger on the pulse of what the fears and anxieties of the day are. And so I really feel that in looking at where horror is, where the cousin of horror, Gothic, which has its own sort of rules, but it is very much within the horror genre, because the Gothic is dealing with atmosphere, setting, character, and psychology. Those things are kind of entwined. And so I really do feel that that tracing the history of the Gothic is also tracing the history of who's being allowed to be published, and who is saying what and when. And so I think that it's really been interesting to track that and continue to track that. And there's been really wonderful marginalized voices who are exploring these fine lines between the beautiful and the terrible. And just to shout out one of my favorite authors in the horror poetry genre, Linda D. Addison, the first Black woman, the first Black person to win a Stoker Award. And she's one of my inspirations. And so Linda D. Addison, if you're looking for horror poetry, one of the best voices out there, and who I just worked with recently, as she's doing the afterword in my upcoming nonfiction about ghostly stories involving women and haunted houses. So she was able to kind of put a bit of a afterward voice on where this all is right now too. So which was very, very exciting. So if you're looking for voices, I highly recommend her too.
Please come in on this discussion.
Absolutely. I'll echo what everyone has said thus far. I think it's been a beautiful evolution to see in horror, the emerging diversity in voices, in part because I think horror, it's undeniable that our diverse experiences yield very diverse and unique fears, and that only makes the genre better when we start listening to them. And I can't speak as to the why, although I think Lucy did a great job of summarizing how the changes in publishing have really opened the door for diverse markets and diverse presses and self-publishing in ways that were really unprecedented. But I think my own experience is that the horror community is quite welcoming and quite deliberately inclusive. Perhaps all of us have our own experiences of being misfits in this love of this odd little genre, and that opens our eyes a little bit to recognizing our uniqueness across differences. And so there does seem to be, in my experience, there's a really welcoming environment in the horror community that's unique and special and kind of wonderful. I found it at all kinds of different events and conferences, and there's just this wonderful celebration where we all sort of connect on these levels of be it from appreciating one another's work to sort of relishing in the old weird texts, or to like the celebration of and the nod to all those wonderful and weird Victorian writers, these women living in these very strange societies where everything was so repressed. I think there's a great tendency not just to look ahead with that diversity in mind, but also to look back and find some of those authors who were writing all along and celebrate it. And it's just been a beautiful thing to see.
Well, you mentioned the idea of horror, of the horror writer is sort of the misfit child is always sort of never that far away. I think horror writers are always very good at being in touch with their inner child, because that inner child has always been kept alive. But that's kind of an extension of being a writer, isn't it? Writers tend to be loners. They tend to be, a little bit on the outsiders, the observers looking in. The horror writing is almost just a natural extension of what you do as a writer to begin with, isn't it?
Mm.
I'll start with E on that one.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
it's okay.
That was an interesting observation. I was just, yeah, I think that's probably reasonable. We may look a little longer at the places that scare us, but some of those tendencies are certainly there. We're just maybe willing to get a little more uncomfortable in the process.
Lucy, Leanna, did you have anything to add on that?
Go on, Leanna.
I think we have to write from what moves and scares us. We have to write from what our fears are. If we're writing about what scares us, it will be conveyed to the reader. I know I've done my job when I shudder at something, and so I will deliberately put in some of my worst fears into a given situation, because I feel like that's touching down on the raw nerve, and I feel like I owe that to the reader to be honest with them. It is vulnerable to do so. All of writing is vulnerable to do so, but you do have to put a bit of yourself into all of this for it to come across vibrantly and especially in this genre, viscerally.
Okay. Lucy?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything I write is going to be a mix of something from inside me, but also, something that's completely made up. And people are going to make speculations based on that. And I'm like, okay, whatever, whatever you want to think, that's fine. But definitely, I feel like we are in touch with our younger selves. And as you said, I think all writers do that, but I think definitely horror writers do, because I can't think of a time when I was more consistently afraid than when I was a child, because I didn't have any agency, I didn't have any control over anything. I mean, as an adult, I only really have a control over, this much, whatever's immediately around me. But, at least I have some, I can control my day. I understand how the world works now. If you're growing up in a place where you don't understand how anything works, and you don't have people necessarily explaining it to you, the darkness is terrifying. You don't really know what's what's out there. You know, your parents said, okay, sure, there's nothing out there that can get you, but you keep hearing noises and you're like, are they telling me the truth? Is there really monsters out there? You know, what's under my bed? I think kids are very prone to superstitions, again, because they don't understand really how the world works. And that was like the first time that I started having serial nightmares that in some ways were more vivid than my waking life. And I've consistently been able to use nightmares in my fiction. I'll get good ideas from them. My friends kind of describe this as definitely a lemons into lemonade kind of a situation. It's like, well, you're going to keep me awake and cost me some sleep, so I might as well make some money off you guys. So cool. But yeah, definitely. I think keeping in touch with one's inner child is a critical thing for any creative endeavor, but especially for horror.
Is there something, you know, when people who, yeah, and none of you exclusively writes horror, and none of you should be identified, no writer should be just identified by one genre or one form. But when you're somewhat known for writing this, people tend to think, oh, you must be a certain way, or you must have a certain. And I can see, you know, some of you smiling here because you've had this experience where people have come up to you at a book signing and say, oh, you're normal, or you're nice, or, you know, or you have a good sense of humor. I've always thought, you know, that horror writers are almost more normal than other people. I think because they have worked through so much of this stuff, you know. I mean,
I think that's true.
You know, you see some kind of, you know, writers who write like the kind of literature that is championed by the New Yorker, you know, about some midlife professors, you know, a midlife crisis, and you know, you find that you talk to them and it's like, but these people are screwed up. But you know, I don't know. I think is it true there is something cathartic to writing horror, to writing this sort of stuff?
I think definitely there is catharsis, but I think there's also willingness to kind of look the ugly straight in the eye that can help a person in, you know, your life, because you're willing to like look at things that other people shy away from things that other people deny are even there. And so I think that all writers globally are kind of messed up. I don't think anybody who's like perfectly sane becomes a writer. I think, you know, if you do a poll of any writers group to find out, you know, who's got whatever diagnoses, whether it's they're neuroatypical or they have depression or anxiety or whatever, I think everybody's going to have something. But I think that horror writers are more inclined to actually do something about it, that we're not going to be trapped in denial or trapped in the, oh, well, what will my family think if I go on, you know, medication, and we'll just go and do it. You know, if we're in a position to do so. So I think it's a mixture of catharsis and also a mixture of just being willing to face things that other people might want to be in denial about. But yeah, people at horror conventions have struck me as being better adjusted than in other environments. I mean, we certainly have had some problematic characters who were not taking care of themselves and were taking things out on other people, and that was really unfortunate. But you can't account for people, you know, behaving badly all the time.
Right.
One of my early ways of self-expression manifested itself in being a goth, and I still am, and I guess now I'm technically an elder goth, as they say. And you know, it goes beyond, like, we're past that it's a phase thing. We're now into no, really, this is a lifelong this is a lifelong thing. But I think for me, it was a way to externalize, like, okay, I've got a dark side and I'm going to have fun with it rather than letting it like stifle me. So here, the whole goth vibe for me was having fun and being playful about it. And so because I've externalized that in my clothing and my attire, it's less surprising for people when they find out that I write about Gothic Victorian things and I'm dressed like a widow in mourning from the 19th century, because I just, you know, that's my favorite style. So, you know, I think in some ways, like, I've managed reader expectation by my physical presentation. However, you know, that's not necessarily going to be everybody's go-to. I think that no one should sort of dress as their work unless it really fits their personality. And it happens to for me, but it was that way of like how I, you know, at age 7, really being drawn to Edgar Allan Poe, but a teacher being like, here, you're weird, you will like this, you know, and receiving a volume of Poe's collected works and it going with me everywhere, becoming my security blanket. at a very young age being like, this is kind of how my mind works. And so, okay, well, then this is how I can kind of navigate the world, externalizing some of these things, exorcising a bit of this, to go back to what Lucy was saying of like being willing to confront these things, look them straight in the eye. I think we are very much exorcising a lot of things through our work.
E?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. There's so many facets and ways in which, as horror writers, we are willing to look at those transgressions and come up with, horror's invention and reflection, right? So you're reflecting about what really terrifies you, or what might have terrified you, or what certain things might have felt like, but then you get to invent all these wild possibilities. And I think in that process of invention, you get to reimagine some of your own views of yourself and your own, your own place in the world. So there's this creation of possibility and space around the things that scare you that maybe is a little liberating. Space is good, reflection is good, and it really just does invite, I don't know, a openness. I won't compare horror writers to other writers. I don't feel, but that's an interesting concept. I know for sure there have been characters that I've written that were certainly, I've never been a werewolf. And it is funny when readers have certain reactions and they think, oh boy, you must have had some kind of wild experience there to create that. But you do tap into your own stories a bit when you're looking for things that you have that really scare you if they're going to really work on some level.
I'm always kind of interested in the point of origin too, and you've all a little bit touched on this, but I want to know if there's anything specific. Was there a moment, because nothing ever quite impacts you as what impacts you as a child and what you're exposed to as a child, and there's so often enough for I know there was with me. Was there a moment, was there a movie, was there a story, was there a TV show, was there, and even just an image, that's something that awoken the call of the creak of the casket and the dungeon door for everybody?
For me, it was when I was a really little kid. My parents had a film projector, and they had a certain number of old films, and one of them was Phantom of the Opera. I must have seen Phantom of the Opera like 100 times before I was 4 years old. And like the moment where Eric is unmasked, I always hid my face when I was a little kid, but that moment was so thrilling. And I think that one movie just really kind of seeped deeply into my consciousness and kind of affected everything since.
Lon Chaney for you. It literally was Lon Chaney from the start.
Yep.
Wow, that's quite a reference. E, how about you?
Gosh, there were an awful lot. If I had to pick maybe one of the fondest ones, it would probably be, I can't remember the name of the album, but it was listening to an album with my mom, and one of the stories that was read was The Telltale Heart. And I remember being riveted by how captivating, and here it was, this is the era of television and movies, and I'm listening to a record and completely riveted by the words and just heart pounding, mind blown, completely in love. So that was probably the birth of my fondness, at least in part, for the genre and for Poe in particular.
Yeah.
I mentioned Poe, and that that at a very early age, and just the language still being just so powerful today. It's very rare that a writer over a century old can still have the power and the cut through to the truth of the matter still to this day. And also, as an adult, I can understand some of the socioeconomic commentary that's happening in a way that I couldn't as a child. But yeah, Poe's just such a important, he really is my North Star in my writing. But this particular book right here, and I have it still, this very beat up book called Haunted Houses, and it's a chapter book, very small little short stories of ghosts and hauntings. And this well-worn, it is a Xerox, literally the publisher is Xerox, so it's one of these old relics, and this went with me absolutely everywhere, and I memorized every single ghost story that's in here. And so that really that's baked in a way that I kind of can't, I don't even know how inextricable it is. It's just it's so much in the DNA. So between Poe and a book about ghosts, that was everything. And then I also really, I was also really obsessed with the Sesame Street special, where they spent the night overnight at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Is a Sesame Street movie called Don't Eat the Pictures, where they try to get Cookie Monster to not eat the art. And so them being trapped overnight in the museum was also very, very thrilling, and has made its way into many different things that I've done since then. So I am an amalgam of Poe and Muppets.
I think that's the first time
That's
I've ever heard
awesome.
Sesame Street cited as a.
But the idea of being overnight at the museum is creepy and wonderful. So, this was long before Night at the Museum. So,
But I've asked that question, and people have said, I saw a commercial when I was 4 years old. I've seen, it can come from anywhere. It literally can come from anywhere in any direction. So, those are marvelous. And it's the horror writers of America couldn't have done it better by keeping Poe in curriculum. It's not theirs, but thank goodness he is. Because everybody gets Poe, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. And what an age to get Poe, and have your imagination fired up. Because here he is, people are giving you reading, and everything seems boring, right? And then all of a sudden, here comes this guy, and he's walling people up and putting people in torture chambers. And isn't this great? Isn't this marvelous? I 1,000 questions left, and we've got about 15 minutes left. But one of the things I want to touch on, because one of the goals of the panel is to help aspiring horror writers or aspiring writers. And the first thing I want to start with is exactly that. As Leanna was talking about in the 19th century, we didn't even have the term horror writer. You were a writer, period. If you were Mary Shelley, you might be writing one kind of novel, another kind of novel. It didn't matter. That's kind of a 20th century branding conceit to this, calling somebody a horror writer or such. Writers are writers, and you write to what you are called to. If you are called to the creak of the dungeon door, you're going to write about that. But what advice would you give to somebody? And you have to realize that if we were sitting in person, there would be a lot of young people sitting in front of us wanting to do what you do. So this is a great opportunity to give them some advice. So, Leanna, let's start with you. What would you advise somebody to do?
Really read voraciously in anything that interests you, and don't worry about whether or not it does or it doesn't necessarily relate to what you're writing. I think that the more things that you know and the more things that you learn, no matter what they are, if you're obsessed about something, really indulge your obsessions, because the more deep dive you go into any type of thing that interests you, the more fodder you're just going to have in your mental Rolodex for a story prompt. So really just follow your bliss, as it were. Follow the things that you just love, because a lot of times with writing, you're not going to love the process of writing. Sometimes I love writing, and yet there are days when it does feel like a slog. So you kind of have to go back and lean in to those things that you're obsessed with to kind of be your wellspring to go back to. And those things can change, and they should change, and your interests should change as you go. And don't be afraid to leave something behind if it's not powering you or inspiring you anymore, and go on to the next thing. And I really just feel that let your creativity kind of go where it needs to go, and have a bit of an open, unconditional love for your creative process, and don't let any other writer or anybody or any teacher tell you that this is the specific way you have to do it, because each one of us here on this panel and any writer you talk to is going to have a completely different process. All you have to do is find your own and find what works for you, and it may not work from one book to the next. So you discard what's not working and go on to the next thing that's working. The only thing that you have to do is still go back to it. You don't have to do it every day, but just keep touching down on it and you will find your way through. But it has to be your way. Like with your own, inner truth and spirituality and all that kind of stuff, it's deeply personal. So is your writing process. So enjoy learning about what your own process is and what works for you, and have some different tools in your toolbox, because you're going to need to use them all.
How would you respond to that question?
In very similar ways, reading widely is probably the first and best advice that I would ever offer anyone. And widely, not just for love of learning and absolutely doing deep dives, but also reading within the genre intentionally and without of the genre to see what's popular, what's not popular, what's been done. If you have a wild idea for, I don't know, whatever, a haunted house story, read 100 haunted house stories and just see how they've been done, see what's worked before. And I say read outside the genre because sometimes finding writers whose style and voice that you enjoy is not always just going to be a magical genre experience. You're going to find writers in all sorts of places that can help you be a better writer. I think that there's, if you're reading and you're writing and you're talking about writing, you're going to become a better writer. It's just time, patience, keep writing, keep at it. I'd also say connect with other writers at various stages of their own, progress. I think it's really important to feel like you have folks you can talk to about your work that you're not related to. You don't just want cheerleaders, you want people who can give you some critical attention and critical time to say, meh, that didn't work, or hey, I'm confused. It's really essential because it's very easy to get two things. It's easy to feel isolated when you're spending a lot of time writing, but it's also really easy to think you're doing something that you may not be doing in your work too. So it's really helpful to connect with other folks. So those are probably my biggest two pieces of advice. If I were going to go with the third, it'd be to develop a process and stick with it, whether it's writing for an hour a day or writing for 10 minutes a day or editing or, whatever that process is, really try to see what works for you and build that writer's toolkit, because there are going to be days when you think, I don't have an idea in my head. So how do I fill that? What do I do with that? Or I have this assignment due and I don't know how to write it. Where do I start? And that's when you really want those resources there to plug into and help get you to the next project.
Lucy?
I want to agree with everything Leanna and E said. Read everything, read widely. I want to jump off of something E said. Read recently as well, because I've run into a lot of people who, Poe is great, but there has been so much written since Poe. If you're writing that haunted house story, look at what's been published in the last 1 or 2 years. I guarantee there will be a lot, because as Leanna said, we're kind of in a resurgence of Gothic fiction right now. So there's a lot to choose from. Also try different things. If you've mostly, been writing novels, try short fiction, try poems, and vice versa. Always look for ways to improve your own personal toolkit of writing skills. Look for opportunities, they're out there. And once you get to the point where you start to send your stuff out, don't give up. Like, rejections are common, they're legion. My first 10 short story sales were much, much, much more difficult than the next 50. Like, there's a hump that you're going to have to kind of get over. And part of that is you are constantly improving your work. You're improving yourself as a writer. But another part is that you're out there networking. The act of sending your work out to an editor is a form of networking. It's a different kind of networking than you get if you went to a conference or a science fiction convention or whatever, but it is a form of networking. As people get to know you, you will have a better shot at getting published. You will also start discovering the places that are more receptive to your work. But yeah, just when you're starting out, read everything, write as much as you possibly can. You don't have to do it every day. But just try to get the work done as best you can. Give yourself the freedom to try different things, to experiment, and just do it. Yeah.
And a second thought on that idea of reading recently, there's so many fabulous online magazines and journals. Take advantage of them, read them. Many of them are free, and you can read amazing work. And it's a way to see what's being published right now by editors who are looking at work right now. Just keep at it, definitely.
I'm really hoping this is not the last question, because this is a little bit depressing to talk about, because it's already been touched on, and that's the economic realities of being a writer in this day and age. And boy, do people need as much advice on this as anything else, because it's the practical side of writing. And we are going through a period where the economic realities are not what they were 40 years ago, when there was a mid list for writers, and you could count on a $40,000, $50,000 advance to get you through a year, and 40 or 50,000 could get you through a year. Back then, we were always going to a point where a lot of writers have the survival jobs like they did in the 1800s, where very few writers actually made a living off of their writing. But we are going through a period where there are a lot more opportunities. But Lucy, I think you were the one who said something about the economic realities of making the living wage at it, which is very, very difficult, and becoming more difficult with each passing year. So, this is advice I think everybody could use right now. What is the landscape right now for somebody who wants to do this, and what's the best way to try to get some traction and get going in this tricky field?
This is hard. This is really hard. And there is no solution that might work for one writer that's going to work for another. It's like, imagine the castles where, the corridors and the stairways are all changing. It's like that for everybody. You can watch somebody who did something 6 months ago and you think, oh, I can do that too. And then suddenly you can't, because everything has changed. Publishing is in an incredible upheaval right now. Everybody's stressed out. Everybody is overworked. I'm not trying to make this sound really depressing, because I'm personally not depressed. I feel like it is true. There are so many opportunities for publishing right now, like more so than I think at any other time in human history. That said, money's a problem. Money's a problem for everybody. You kind of have to keep a long view and have a long-term plan in place. You will end up working a bunch of really crummy jobs to support yourself. Why is this? Because really crummy jobs won't necessarily follow you home. If you end up with a really high-paid career type job, and I'm not necessarily discouraging anybody from pursuing this, it becomes a lot more difficult to protect your writing time, to protect your creative time. And that is critical. No matter what you do, you got to figure out, when are you most productive as a writer, and protect that time as best you can. This becomes infinitely more difficult for women, particularly if you start having kids, because regardless of anybody's best intentions, childcare typically falls on the woman. And that sucks. It's a thing. I do know women who have multiple kids who are successful writers, but they had to do a lot of negotiating, a lot of planning, a lot of figuring things out. How am I going to make this crazy thing work? But the biggest thing is look at your situation and figure out, how can you preserve your writing time, your writing energy. And the time and energy thing becomes more complex as you get older. It's like, you're going to have a lot of motivation, a lot of energy when you're younger. You might not have the time because you're in college. You're having to work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your head. Later on, you're like, I've got this time, but I've completely blown all my brains on my job during the day. What do? I just want to sit and watch TV. There will be some days like that. And go easy on yourself. Don't beat yourself up because you're like, I didn't get any writing done today, I suck. Don't try not to think that way. But if you've gone a month and you haven't gotten any writing done, take a step back and say, okay, what can I do to fix this? How can I carve out the time? How can I carve out the energy? What can I try differently to get this done? So yeah.
Okay. Leanna?
For
Same
me,
thing.
I try to double up on things. One of the reasons why I became a New York City tour guide is because I knew I wanted to write books set in New York City. So all the history I was learning about New York City for my tour guide job, it went right into all of my books. So whatever you can do to double up on interests and have that be a professional thing that's kind of going in a parallel line. When I'm researching a particularly interesting woman, historical figure, I have a little folder that goes into a presentation topic that I can pitch to libraries. I work with several different libraries and I do virtual talks for them, and they have small budgets, and it's not enormous money, but it comes in between my other book deadlines. I'm also published with many different kinds of publishers at many different levels of publishers. I'm published with small presses. I'm published with large presses. I'm also doing audiobook narration for one of the online publications that is working with some of my work. And so I think also diversifying the ways in which you are a storyteller. If you do have a performance background, you can really leverage that, where you're also doing performative storytelling in addition to the writing storytelling that you're doing. So for me, being an actor and being a writer, they're always kind of coined. So if you can find something that supports your writing and also then has another avenue that either has a storytelling component or where the research you're doing for it then helps what you're doing. If you can figure out where there's doubling up happens, then you're just using your time to the most efficient way possible.
Okay, and E, we're going to give you the last word.
Sure. I think that's really brilliant advice from my co-panelists here, and I would add to that, seek out balance. Obviously, there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs situation, and you need to take care of yourself, of course. But also, I think it's essential that Lucy really hit on the idea of preserving your writing time. For some folks, that writing time might be a time when they wouldn't be at work anyway, and so it's there are ways to creatively outthink. Sometimes with varying degrees of success, how that looks on a day-to-day basis, and it's okay if it looks like something maybe you didn't expect. And I usually encourage folks to think hard and honestly about their goals. And if $1 million book deal contract is one of them, then it's important to be super realistic about probabilities. And I think most folks that are working hard at writing aren't necessarily doing it because we imagine $1 million book contracts. I would be one of those. I do not imagine $1 million book contract. So I think balance and clarity with what you need and what you want and what you're hoping for, I think are really helpful in terms of structuring what your expectations are and how much time you can give it. And at the same time, to not end on a sad note. I think there are just as many reasons to keep going in spite of not maybe reaching that level of financial lucrative contracts. You can find other motivations. So when I have worked with beginning writer groups, I usually start with, what are your goals as a writer? And you build your writing life around those goals because they're going to be different for everyone. And I think that can help folks be realistic, but also optimistic about what they can bring with their work.
Well, there's certainly better and smarter ways to make $1 million. I'll say that.
Yes, I'm sure there are.
Well, listen, this hour has just absolutely flown by, and I am so greedy. I would love to turn this almost to a mini series and do like a series of 3 of these, because I got through about that much of what I wanted to talk about. But it was all great, and I thank you all for participating in this. This has really been wonderful. So a round of applause and thanks to our panelists. And that's again, Leanna, Renee, Hieber, E.F. Schraeder, and Lucy A. Snyder. You are all just terrific. A reminder that you can get copies of their books and all of the books by all of the authors of Ohioana at the Book Loft in German Village or at bookloft.com. Great place. If you've never been there, you have got to go. You will lose. It's like a vortex opening up. You will lose a good part of your life if you go into that place. And then thanks again to our festival sponsors and partners, and thank you for joining us, all of you. Please check out the Ohioana website for all of this year's festivals programming. Thank you again to all of you. It was great.
Thank you.